Welcome back. I'm Tanya Granic Allen, and I host a daily commentary show right here on the news forum called Counterpoint. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by one of our country's most preeminent economists, Dr. Jack Mintz, President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Welcome, Dr. Jack. Thank you so much for joining me. We're going to have an interesting discussion, and, well, where does one even start here? I guess let's take a general overview of what's going on, a lay of the land, if you will. On a scale of 0, because we're going to start at 0 to 10, what is the state of the Canadian economy as you see it?
Well, I think in terms right now, as we are still dealing with this pandemic, it's not great, obviously. I mean, the health restrictions are in. There are people that are unemployed and they're not working. There are some people that have done fine, but there's many people who have lost jobs that may not even be able to go back to an employer that they were hoping to go to. So, it's really a rough economy out there. And of course, there's a lot of businesses that have lost people, customers. They've been closed. Some have opened up, but they're not even sure, some of them, that they're going to be able to continue to exist, while others have done quite fine and are, especially like the technology companies. So again, very much a mix.
Yeah, definitely a mix. And I've interviewed different folks from different sectors, from small businesses to medium businesses, and it's like it's been quite the pressure cooker, if you will, for the last year. But when we look at Canada and we look at other countries on a similar scale, how are we faring economically with our peers?
Well, I think my concern hasn't been so much, with the pandemic. We got hit hard because we are a resource-based economy, and as a result, we had a double whammy. We had the pandemic that caused a lot of people not to work in the service sector, but we also had the resource sector that was heavily impacted by falling commodity prices at the beginning of the pandemic. But my bigger concern over Canada is more how we performed before the pandemic hit. We had very poor investment. In fact, a piece that I put out last week, we showed that between the period 2015 and 2019, Canada had 4 countries with negative growth in investment. We were far worse than the rest of the OECD countries, and Brazil, China, India, and Brazil, India, the BRIC countries, and Russia. Anyway, so as a result, having negative growth, there were only Mexico and Australia and us and Brazil were in that position. Everybody else was positive and had much better growth in their investment during that period, which is critical for long run productivity,
Right.
and growth in incomes. And so that is a real significant problem. And in fact, I did another piece to show that per capita economic growth, GDP growth in Canada, from the period 2016 to 2020, including the pandemic year, was negative, actually, over that period. And it's the first time that's happened since the Great Depression. And so I think we have to be very worried about coming back as an economy, where we're going to do a far better job than what we did even before the pandemic hit. And of course, the pandemic made things even worse.
Yes, well, it sounds, as you just explicated very well, that we weren't in a good fiscal footing as we entered this unprecedented pandemic situation, and that's really quite a shame, because obviously it's been now a year, and we need to know how we're going to move forward. Before we talk about recovery, I do want to spend just a few minutes discussing how Canada's response has been internally to cope with the COVID response. Obviously there's a COVID recession, and there was an interesting study on whether this was a self-imposed or an artificial economic downturn due to, obviously, the government and safety restrictions, et cetera. I've always wondered, if we just simply raise the restrictions and lift the lockdown restrictions today, would our economy actually recover?
The health restrictions would help a lot. And in fact, the other good news right now is that commodity prices have come back. And in fact, for many of the commodities, they're actually higher than ever, like forest products, as an example. So So both of those things, I think, will be a help to the Canadian economy. But we should be very careful not to rest on our laurels. We have a lot of serious drawbacks, particularly our lack of innovation, our lack of investment in buying the latest vintages of machinery and structures that kind of lead to more productivity. And if we keep slipping relative to the United States, as we've been doing, including the pandemic year, we will eventually start finding ourselves in a brain drain again, which happened in the 1990s. So we have to be very careful and mindful about our position relative to the rest of the world, which frankly has been slipping
Right.
over the past 5 years.
Well, speaking of the United States, obviously, they have a new government, a new president. Uh, are we still competitive with the United States? I mean, they're our closest trading partner. They're our closest neighbors, obviously, geographically. How are we competitively with the United States?
Well, I think when it comes to venture capital firms or young people where they want to be there, they'll go to the large market. United States being still a significant draw for them. In fact, there's good data to show that that's the case. Many companies in Canada that start doing well eventually sell out. We effectively, even in the technology field, basically become a branch plant. We're graduating a lot of engineers with very good training out of Canadian universities, subsidized training by Canadian taxpayers, and they end up getting hired by Google and Facebook and all the major technology companies. And the really good ones are skimmed off and go to the United States. The rest remain in Canada, working in more technical type jobs that are being created by these companies. And in terms of our own companies, technology companies that uh, do tend to grow and succeed, there are some that have done very well. Obviously, Shopify, and but there are many that actually have started off extremely well and then eventually got bought off. And so again, we're going back to the period that we went through 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's why the competitiveness issue is extremely important. And we're going to need to address that after this pandemic because it is, I think, really one of the significant weaknesses for the Canadian economy.
Well, okay, and I still do want to talk a little bit more about the COVID response, but since you brought it up and we were talking about brain drain, what should or can Canadian companies, or I suspect even the government, do to incentivize Canadians that we train, that we pay for their training in some cases, to remain here in Canada rather than we train them to go and take that investment elsewhere?
Well, and some of the things could be done, for example, forgivable loans. Like, if you're going to give student debt, well, if you leave the country and work somewhere else, you pay back your student debt. But if you stay in Canada, then maybe we'll give you some relief. That we did that with tuition fee tax credits, which was done where people could use it for future years. So I know, for example, many students that had very large tuition fee tax credit, especially if they went down to the United States to get their degree, but they could come back to Canada and use them. And for the first several years, didn't even pay income tax because of it. So,
Wow.
so that's another little inducement. So there's things like that that could kind of encourage our people to stay here, but ultimately it's the jobs. And if we end up with a falling exchange rate, then our salaries drop below the United States. If we don't get the productivity increases going, then that's a negative. And of course, one of the big advantages Canada has is livability. Except for the cold weather, which frankly is a negative. But certainly, we're politically, more stable than many countries, and I would say even relative to the United States these days. So I think that there are some positives that we can still build up to make sure that we keep our young people here.
Right, and obviously people want to go where there are jobs, where the money is, as you mentioned. So, seeing that we're coming out, well, hopefully we're coming out very soon out of this COVID recession, or that we're going to start, building back. How long do governments need to actually stimulate the economy? Like, what timeline are we looking here?
Well, I think it will depend really on the pandemic. If the pandemic with vaccinations, finally sputters out over the next year, that will help. But we have to remember that Europe is slow like us in the rollout. And in fact, we won't have our population vaccinated probably until the fall. And so, even though the United States may be fully vaccinated or really well on their way and growing quite a bit, that's not going to be much help to us in terms of us getting out of the pandemic. So we need to move much faster on getting people vaccinated, getting our herd immunity. But we have to remember globally, there's going to be large parts of the world that's going to be the same way.
Right.
And then, of course, we're worried about variants and everything else that could mean that we have to get revaccinated. In fact, I suspect that I'm finally going to get my vaccinations done next week. But I suspect that I'm going to have to get vaccinated in a year's time. And in fact, if there's new variants, we may have to see new vaccines even come out, which will probably happen. But again, it's all going to mean that the economy will be slower in coming back than we would hope.
Yes, and I'm on pins and needles waiting for this time, but you're right. It may not be a very definitive, okay, everything's open, let's get back to business. We could take several months, perhaps even years. So thinking back to that, the government in this time has been I guess you could say quite generous, for lack of a better term, federally at least, in doing a lot to stimulate, to help Canadians where they need help. So helping with small business loans or with the CERB payments, things like this. But there has been concerns that the Canadian government has been taking on too much debt. So I guess I'm going to put that question to you. Are we taking on too much debt? Did we actually need all this stimulus? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think the stimulus was overdone. Uh, we needed to do it. In fact, we told people to stay at home. I think governments really had to compensate people for what they did in terms of the lockdowns. Uh, but not many countries did what we did. Maybe the United States is the only one besides us that gave so much money that people's household income actually went up during the pandemic. I mean, this is unheard of for a recession. People are actually better off than they were before the pandemic. And that's because the government transfers were so rich. Now, at the beginning, they had to get out quickly, and that was a response that I think was appropriate. But we should have learned how to target things better after that. And even on the business loans, I think we could have targeted really to the sectors that were hurt the most. Uh, and I think that we still have major issues with airlines, airports, uh, and certain parts of the economy, the entertainment sector, and things like that are and restaurants are still very hurt by the pandemic, and probably should be the ones we should make sure that they're getting support, at least in the near term. But I do think that we did go overboard, and some of the things were totally unnecessary. Like a good example is We Charity. I mean, no
Right.
question. Uh, to me, in my mind, it was totally unnecessary to have an additional post-secondary education program costing $1 billion uh, because we were already giving students some support over the summer, and just how much money do you keep pouring out? It was just, to me, it was just overdone.
Right, right. And I think your sentiments echo the thoughts of many Canadians. Well, I guess the good news is hopefully good news is the first federal budget in 2 years is about to be tabled on April 19th. What should the government be doing to fast track recovery? And perhaps more importantly, what should they not be doing?
Well, I think the federal budget is going to set up a very important debate, and that is, do you have recovery where we have to bring in every social program we didn't have before the pandemic, whether it's pharmacare, a new child care program, a new uh, uh, guaranteed annual income, et cetera, et cetera. All of them really with the intent of looking at redistribution
Hmm.
rather than growth. My view is that we need to get people back to work. In fact, giving a job is really the best form of charity you can give to anybody. And there are going to be people that are going to need help getting new jobs. There'll be more permanently unemployed people. a lot of the temporary unemployed people will come back, especially as the health restrictions come off. But the ones who are permanently under unemployed are going to be needing help. So I think a budget should be focused on things like training grants. It should be focused on business investment that has been lacking in this country. All the things that would spur growth. And we should not be looking at a whole bunch and introducing a whole bunch of new programs.
Okay, well, I guess we can hold out hope and see what happens on the 19th. But, mentioning a lot of these social programs that were sort of being peaked prior to this pandemic, there has been talk by the World Economic Forum and other bodies about building back better. And of course, our conference theme is building back right. But using the current crisis, however, to accelerate social change and economic goals, maybe even including pushing green tech, to me, again, this conference theme is building back right. What does this mean to you, and what sort of policy goals should Canada emphasize, if at all, any of them at all?
Well, I think the policy goal should be, well, again, there's a debate of what you mean by right and better and all this when you're saying building back. By the way, I don't know if most people understand, but building back better actually started with the Japanese after the nuclear disaster that they had. And it was really all about building better infrastructure than what they had before, more up to date and things like that. And that makes sense. I think when we're looking at building back better for Canada, we should be asking ourselves, what are the issues that we weren't doing very well on before coming into this pandemic? And if we are going to devote resources to it, how can we build back better or right in that sense? And that's why I keep going back to the fact that we had very low productivity
Mm-hmm.
growth after 2015. We had very little. We've had very little investment after 2015, and we can't continue doing that. Otherwise, we're going to slip far behind, and we are going to lose production to other countries and employment to other countries, and we're going to lose resources to other countries. So, again, my focus would be things like training, good programs for getting people to take on new types of jobs. Unleash entrepreneurs so that they will build jobs. I mean, that's one thing I like about Alberta. It's a very entrepreneurial economy, and so we've pushed personal income tax rates above 50%.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you do that, that actually becomes a very significant disincentive to the people that tend to create innovative ideas. We Our corporate tax rate actually is relatively high now.
Yes.
It's about 26%. The highest you find is in Japan, a little bit over 30%, and Portugal 31.5. So we're near the top, and that tends to discourage people to put kind of like the knowledge-based type investments into Canada with very high returns. And so I think that is something that we have to think about, is how to get a better balance in our corporate tax system. I think the accelerated depreciation was a big mistake and should have never been done in the first place, because all that did was attract marginal projects, didn't really try to attract the projects with really high rates of return, which is what everybody is now more concerned about these days. And when you look at the United States, where their big returns coming from, it's from the Facebooks and from the Netflixes and
Right.
things like that, where rates of return are very high. That's what we need to do, is encourage more of these technology, high rates of return investments in Canada. And our tax system is out of kilter, I think, for that. And I think we need to fix that up. And then I think the other part of building back also is making sure that we have more infrastructure spending by the federal government if they do anything else. And they have to be very careful. They shouldn't be having big blowout expenditures that will end up funding white elephants and bridges to nowhere. Instead, they should be quite deliberative and thinking about what sort of things we need, such as improving our ability to take goods to Tidewater, so that we can export more to other parts of the world. And then finally, I think we really need to do something on our internal trade in Canada, which has been hurting our own productivity, where it is easier to end up exporting to the United States than, let's say, a BC firm to export to Ontario.
Okay, so what recommendations would you have if you could wave a wand and say implement these measures to facilitate better interprovincial trade? What would you see implemented?
Well, I would like to see removal of some of the restrictions on professionals so that they can work in any province rather than the way that it's handled right now, which kind of creates little monopolies in each province because other people coming in can't get their professional designation. I would like to see regulations that kind of smooth out things. That if a truck is going across Canada, it doesn't have to change its tires because it goes into a province with different regulations and the type of tires it has. There's a whole bunch of little things like that. But again, I give credit to Alberta. Alberta is the only province that said we are unilaterally going to get rid of some of these barriers to trade, and they've done that recently, and inviting other provinces to join that. And I think it's about time the other provinces wake up to do that. But I think the federal government has a role in helping facilitate an internal union. After all, Section 121 of the BNA Constitution, sorry, of the Constitution Act now, is very clear about trade and the need to avoid barriers to trade. I think the federal government should be pushing harder than provinces to try to get this solved so that we could actually have a stronger common market. And by the way, Australia has done that, and that's really been one of their bigger successes compared to Canada.
Okay, well, perhaps we can learn something from our neighbors in Australia. I want to talk about the carbon tax for a moment. Canada is set to set the price at carbon at $170 a ton by 2030, which puts us at the highest rate in all of the US, but of course California, except of California, and certainly we're above China and many other countries. Since Canada has always lagged in productivity and competitive economic measures, I'm concerned about this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have two concerns about our current carbon policies. We have a government right now on steroids that is pursuing every type of policy. I mean, economists like myself have argued the value of let's say, carbon pricing, and that could be a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. I actually kind of like cap and trade systems myself, but either a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. That once you have a single price, the market will figure out how to deal with the price, and you don't need a bunch of mandates like, getting rid of all, gasoline-powered cars or mandates that you have to have green energy or solar energy or wind energy, and or you don't have to have a bunch of subsidies like for buying electric vehicles and
Hmm.
things like that. All that could be avoided by having a carbon pricing. But instead, our government is pursuing everything, including lately a carbon fuel standard or regulation that actually is just raising the price of gasoline and diesel products, which is no different than a fuel tax.
Right.
And so like what are we really doing here? We seem to be, it's a very costly regime, and so we're adding on a lot of costs to these carbon policies. So that's one thing which I'm very concerned about, is to have a much more rational one and a real plan in terms of how we are going to deal with the future energy transition, and understanding the costs of that plan. The other point is I don't think we should be moving ahead of our most important trading partners. Well, I guess that's the United States, since they take 75% of our goods and services. I think we need to be harmonized with the US.
Right.
And so if the US is going to have, like California has a cap and trade system, which, by the way, is a low price, lower than one we have. But if the US is going to be stuck around $30 in carbon pricing, I don't think we should go further than them. Now, if they're going to do a bunch of mandates and things like that, then we can have a carbon price that goes higher. But then one of the bigger issues that I think is going to come down the road at $170 is, do we put a carbon tariff on in order to protect competitiveness of our industries? Because otherwise, we're going to have carbon leakage. We're going to have businesses
Right.
who avoid the carbon price in Canada moving to United States or China or whatever, where there's lower carbon prices. And so in that case, if we put on a carbon tariff, that raises an interesting set of issues. Do we put a tariff on manufactured goods coming from the United States into Canada? And I've been looking at that, and I can tell you by 2030, it could be a pretty stiff tariff. And so that raises kind of why we might want to be more harmonized with the US and try to work through this whole system energy transition that's going to be at least cost as possible, but also keep in line with what other countries are doing and not try to be way ahead of every other country in terms of hiking up taxes and putting in mandates and putting in subsidies.
Now, speaking of harmonizing Canada, the United States, and in certain components, you've argued, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we need a unified energy framework. The ongoing opposition that we've seen in the United States to our pipelines has been horrible, and especially as it impacts Alberta. What would you see a unified framework look like so that we can not be in this terrible situation? Again, my thoughts specifically to Alberta.
Well, I think we have to remember there's more than just environmental issues that are relevant to energy policy. What's also relevant is the fact that energy is really one of the major factors that have led to economic growth around the world for centuries. And it is important to have cheap and reliable energy. Reliable being that you're not going to get a bunch of brownouts every time you're running a system or blackouts. And so to do that, we're going to need to have a we should be looking at North America as a way of making sure we can have cheap energy resources, cheap as possible, following our environmental objectives at the same time. And to the extent that we use that energy to create a competitive advantage for North America, all the better. And I think for the United States, it could be important in terms of geopolitical risk, where being less reliant on other countries gives them more maneuverability in dealing with some security issues that they're going to deal with as a country. And since we're going to be allied with the United States, those security issues are relevant to us as well. So when I put that all together, we should be encouraging the use of oil and gas. It's not going to go away entirely. I mean, every plan that I've seen going to net zero by 2050 has a very significant role for oil and gas, both in terms of hydrogen and in terms of plastics, because that's still a critical part of everything that we build. And every forecast would suggest that we're going to have a need for oil and gas. And so if we're going to do that, then why shouldn't the United States take Canadian oil as long as it's competitive and cheap enough to be used as part of their needs? And so killing Keystone XL really wasn't necessarily in their interest. And certainly Line 5, Enbridge's Line 5 in Michigan, could become a real hot story because not stopping that line is not only going to hurt Ontario and Quebec consumers, but it's also going to hurt Michigan and Ohio consumers at the same time. So, we need to start looking at these things better. And there's also electric lines that could go down to the United States. There's a proposal for a major Quebec line to go through Maine into Northeast England, and Maine is objecting to it and is now going to have a referendum on it, which you can bet what's going to happen with that referendum will probably get stopped. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of things that Canada and the United States could sit down and say, okay, here's what we need. We need a vibrant energy sector. We need to get cheap energy. We need to have clean energy as much as possible, which is not just climate change, but also other areas as well. And then try to work out good arrangements, keeping in mind all these objectives. And I think that's one reason I thought an energy deal would be good with the United States if we could get to that.
If we could get to that.
I'm not sure we can.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. Is it a reality at all given the current administrations? But I'm going to switch gears. We only have about a minute left. Housing prices, they're front and center again. The CMHC had put in measures to cool things. But again, perennial low interest rates, they seem to have spiked in interest in inflating prices. What are your thoughts, and what can be done? What can we be done to tackle this issue? In again, 1 minute we have left.
Build, baby, build. That would be the answer. We need more supply. That's a way to keep prices down. And there's been a lot of things done that have actually discouraged supply. And part of that is because of the urban planning that some of the large cities have done, where they wanted to encourage densification, but people living in much smaller residences. But nowadays, actually, post-COVID, that's not going to be very desirable for a lot of people. They want to have more space,
right?
And so we're going to have to recognize that. And I think what we need to do is make sure the supply of housing is going to be much better than what we've been doing in order to keep prices down. And I think that trying to give subsidies to people, first home buyers. That's exactly the wrong policy. That just drives up demand, drives up prices more. Putting on new taxes on housing that's already facing a lot of taxes, including property taxes, and in some provinces, land transfer taxes. Putting more taxes on is not going to work either. In fact, even the ones that were put on foreign buyers really have done very little, I think, to cool the market. So, and then eventually interest rates are going to go up. Monetary policy will get more restrictive, and that will help cool the housing market down as well.
Okay, well, Dr. Jack Mintz, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, President and President's Fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, thank you so much for your insights.